Hello everyone, and welcome to this audio podcast. In this audio podcast series, the SZ Loci Equinox. This is another audio podcast. Sort of collaborative. There's an RPSG and KDOS collaborative along with Astor Ballistix production. And this is a audio podcast as part of the Ballistix edition. This is the Shientist, and today I'm gonna provide an overview, sort of around nephrotoxic nephritis or NTN. Listeners may well be aware that this particular audio podcast was also aired as part of a sort of a previous radio edition, and part of the edition, as part of a sort of an audio podcast edition, as part of the sort of audio podcast series around the science armada. And that audio podcast is available, and however, here I thought I'd provide a sort of a more contextualized sort of overview, if you like, around this particular focus. So to begin with, research surrounding sort of animal models has shown that crucial interaction between inflammatory cells and cells intrinsic to renal pathophysiology that is both fundamental and unique to pathogenesis of particular conditions. For example, glomerulonephritis or GN. The terminology glomerulonephritis generally encompasses a range of immune-mediated disorders that causes inflammation within the glomerulus and other compartments surrounding the renal pathophysiology. The mechanisms of interaction between these cells and mediators of sort of coordinated responses and to inflammation are being sort of elucidated and highlighted in literature. However, and despite these sort of pathophysiological advances, treatments for glomerulonephritis or GN, for example, remain non-specific and somewhat hazardous and only partly successful. Therefore, GN remains sort of a common cause of chronic kidney disease globally, as well. So the mechanisms around this are that evidence of complement deposition within the glomerulus is sort of a main feature of many forms of glomerulonephritis, and a role of complement is implied by several observations in human disease. Indirect evidence obtained from human investigations have been supported by findings through investigations by the use of animal models. So the mechanisms by which macrophages mediate renal injury remains to be confirmed, at least in some contexts, but it is likely to include sort of promotion of inflammation through a release of pro-inflammatory cytokines such as tumor necrosis factor or TNF, alongside recruitment of macrophages and other leukocytes through release of chemotactic molecules. Chemotactic molecules include, for example, monocyte chemotactic protein 1 or MCP1, and cell proliferation by release of growth factors such as macrophage colony stimulating factor MCSF, and have been identified and established. Cell death occurs through the release of reactive oxygen species, including nitric oxide, and control of fibrosis and repair through release of various and particular enzymes. The epidemiology around this is that the population-based screening investigations have identified that evidence surrounding renal damage by proteinuria, for example, or hematuria, low circulated glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, or a combination of these features is present in around 16% or just under 20% of adults in one investigation that was conducted in Australia, and a similar proportion in context of the United States. Accurate classification requires a histological diagnosis. Consequently, the reported prevalence might vary according to local indications, according to renal investigations such as renal biopsies. A retrospective analysis of renal biopsies or investigations performed in around between sort of 95 and 97 in Australia, in Australian state of Victoria during 95 and 97 had identified that just over 21 individuals over 21 people per 100,000 population per year underwent renal investigations where renal biopsy was concerned, yielding an annual incidence of biopsy-proven glomerulonephritis of 12.3 per 100,000. The most commonly diagnosed types of GN in adults were IgA nephropathy, focal and segmental glomerulosclerosis, and vasculitis. Those most commonly diagnosed in pediatrics or young people as well were minimal change disease, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, lupus nephritis, and also IgA nephropathy. The pathogenesis around this is the pathogenesis of GN is unfortunately quite complex. Intricacy arises from factors such as autoimmunity. There can be conditions relating to cancer and structural abnormalities within the sort of renal pathophysiology, and there is variability in susceptibility to GN, which is likely to have a genetic basis, and there are also complex interactions between soluble factors, including antibodies, complement chemokines, cytokines, and growth factors, and cells, both leukocytes and intrinsic renal cells that mediate glomerular inflammation. The contribution of non-specific factors such as hypertension and proteinuria promote sort of a continuing sort of renal injury or damage despite resolution of initial insult. A constant feature of GN is the presence of inflammatory leukocytes within the glomerula, within the glomerulus, and the interstitial compartments of the kidneys. Macrophages and T lymphocytes are the dominant cell types that are present as part of pathogenesis, and the intensity of cell accumulation, and particularly with the interstitium, rather than the glomerulus, has repeatedly been identified to correlate with sort of the clinical and pathological severity of disease in animal models and in human beings as well. The three main things around animal models here, so I'm going to highlight specifically. So number one, animal models are used during research and investigations of human diseases. The animals selected will usually meet a sort of determined taxonomic equivalency to humans in order to react to disease or its treatment in a way that resembles human physiology. So that's number one. Number two, research relating to nephrotoxic nephritis, glomerulonephritis, can be traced back to the 1960s and late 1970s, when observations were reported on the role of complement in NTN produced in the rat models by either rat models by either rabbit or duck and nephrotoxic sera or NTS. Number three, in addition, the course of complement reactions in the glomerulus in nephrotoxic nephritis is used and has been used as a measure of the course of immunological events in the disease that is glomerulonephritis. Animal models of GN glomerulonephritis also closely replicate features of human glomerulonephritis and have provided sort of insights into the disease specifically. The reproducibility and uniformity of such animal models have and has also permitted a sort of step-by-step dissection of many of the mechanisms involved. Nephrotoxic nephritis is produced experimentally by the intravenous injection of antibody directed against glomerular basement membrane or GBM antigens of recipient species. Most of the accumulated inflammatory cells in many forms of human and experimental glomerulonephritis are macrophages. So in and around sort of animal models as well, and in mice models, the BALB-C murine models have helped clarified sort of the pathogenesis in several renal conditions or renal diseases. In sort of retrospective research, 6-week-old female BALB-C murine models were induced with injection of 50 milligrams or 0.2 mils bacterial lipopolysaccharide from Salmonella, Minnesota twice a week for 5 weeks by the intraperitoneal route. In all murine models, given injections, features of polyclonal B cell activation or PBA and GN glomerulonephritis had developed. And this animal sort of model presents features that often encountered in human glomerulonephritis, and particularly those associated with bacterial infection, as well as autoimmune diseases such as systemic lupus erythematosus or SLE. In rat models, as an example, the WKY rat strain is also highly susceptible to experimental models of crescentic glomerulonephritis or CRGN, including NTN, nephrotoxic nephritis, and experimental autoimmune glomerulonephritis have been evident, so EAG. The rats in a particular investigation showed development of NTN phenotypes, including glomerular crescents. More recently, CRGN have been identified induced on a normally resistant rat genetic background, and identifies Lewis strain on two genetic loci, CRGN1 and CRGN2, as a new, potentially valuable model for nephrotoxic nephritis and glomerulonephritis. The nephrotoxic serum or NTS WKY rat has also been used in research. Macrophages and T lymphocytes are the sort of dominant sort of cell types present, and the intensity of cellular accumulation, particularly with the interstitium rather than glomerulus, has been identified to correlate with sort of the clinical and pathological severity of disease in animal models and in humans. In line with this, also there's a role of chemokines. So the migration of inflammatory cells in an extravascular site requires a series of coordinated signals, including the generation of a chemotactic gradient by the cells of extravascular compartment. The nature of the stimulus and the subsequent spectrum of chemotactic factors produced determine the specific leukocyte population recruited to the inflammatory site. Members of the chemokine sort of family or superfamily play a sort of central role in this process by attracting a stimulating specific subsets of leukocytes. Animals genetically deficient in chemokines are resistant to disease induction, although results have not been unified, with an unexpected attenuation of experimental anti-glomerular basement membrane disease seen in sort of murine models deficient in CCR1, a receptor for RANTES, and macrophage inflammatory protein 1. Chemokines are thus identified as important in murine models and clearly active in sort of human disease. Interestingly, one team had identified CXCR3 deficient murine models to investigate the functional role of CXCR3 in and under the renal in and around renal pathophysiology and under sort of laboratory based investigations. Nephrotoxic nephritis, NTN, has been induced to analyze the molecular mechanisms of T cell recruitment in glomerulonephritis by CXCR3 and three particular ligands: IP10, CXCL10, and CXCL9, but also ITAC and CXCL11, and to identify potential new targets for therapeutic interventions. So research had identified that a chemokine receptor CXCR3 mediates renal T cell recruitment and subsequent tissue injury in NTN. And one of the overall sort of findings of the investigation provided a rationale for considering CXCR3 blockade in T helper and TH1 mediated renal inflammation as a future therapeutic option for recipients with GN and GN subsets. So the overview around this sort of audio podcast is as thus. So future sort of efforts are required really to translate animal model research in order to sort of achieve a better understanding of GN or glomerulonephritis disease in humans. The complexity of GN research makes findings a challenge to replicate sort of consistently. And so finally, there should be, or at least must be, a continuing evidence-based sort of assessment of immune and non-immune therapies in order to provide sort of those bench to sort of bedside practice for those who are suffering.